What's going on, everybody? We are back after a long hiatus. It is I, Quilt Chamberlain, joined today by my co-host, the big Signorelli, Andrew Flores. Many other monikers are vertically suspended from the horizontal metonymic chain that we'll be exploring today. Andrew, how are you feeling?
I'm feeling well. It's really good to be back after a long hiatus. Although we did meet up in person to give a nice presentation with Daniel with Tut. So we weren't just in a hiatus. We definitely were forging our craft. We were still theoretically sparring, getting these signifying chains
Exactly.
going.
Yes. And bear in mind that when you don't hear from us for a period of time, we are in the lab in the hyperbolic logical time chamber,
Exactly.
working on our craft, sparring, hitting those bags,
Mhm.
theoretical style. So the grind never stops until it does, which brings us to today's topic, the quilting point. The only thing that will stop the metonymic grind, which is psychotic in nature, should we not be able to stop metonymy. And I actually did write something today
Mhm.
about the quilting point chapter. I don't think it'll take too long to read. Forgive me if it does. If you get bored, pause the video, watch some stand up and come back. But we'll have a free form discussion after I read
We should also add that the quilting
what I
point
wrote.
is also just not only stopping the metonymic chain, but also is what, marks the point of signification to stop the analytic session for that day.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. For sure. I mean, it's a multifarious term which has been used for different purposes. And after I read this, I'm sure Andrew can help clear up some of the ambiguities here and ensure that these different various meanings, which are interrelated, don't get too absorbed into one another. Um, so I will begin. So, rather than viewing the quilting point through a purely ideological lens as a kind of utility which serves certain theoretical agendas, I think it would be more useful for us to understand the quilting point in the context of the discussion of metaphor and metonymy, which the three of us had 2 episodes back.
Mhm.
Metonymy, as we remember, it is the pure contiguity of language, signifiers, word to word, the arrangement of words, phonemes, sentences, or even larger units of language in a linear arrangement. Metonymy is classically defined, of course, as an instance in which an attribute of something stands for the whole of which it forms an aspect or part. The crown is a famous example. The crown's metonymic of the royal family in England, for
Mhm.
example. Crown is something that the King of England would wear, but we all know how to translate the crown into the whole of which it's a part, the royal family in our minds. Lacan's definition of metonymy, on the other hand, is more circumscribed. I could have said circumcised, but I didn't. That's a slip that suggests itself. See, it's like that would be a quilting point in a sense. Both more circumscribed and broader at the same time. Yet it has something to do with the notion of an attribute of something standing for the object of which it is a property. But all in all, it has more to do with the arrangement of signifiers prior to, let's say, the imposition of the name of the father, up for debate. But the signifying chain functions prior to the paternal metaphor's activation as a kind of endless metonymy, I would say. Lacan reworks Jacobson and Saussure to give expression to this chain, which is born of the signification to signification route that meaning takes, and the desire, which is, we could say almost the fossil fuel extracted from the end result, but also the grease needed to keep the wheels in motion in a sense. But we're not going to talk too much about desire today, I don't think. In response to this endless proliferation of the word to word extension of language, an intervention of metaphor serves as this solution to continuity here. When I say solution to continuity, I'm referring to a moment which fractures the chain, a sudden upsurge of meaning which abolishes meaning by introducing a kind of meaningfulness or signifiance. It solves the issue of this covariant dependency of the signifier to signifier procession within this extension in which nothing could be pinned down prior to this metaphoric moment. No object can be isolated. No real ego ideal can be invoked within the frame of this other, because without the metaphor, this moment of discontinuity, which would retroactively order all of the elements to appear in view of an I, letter I, a shifter, or also another name for the name of the father, that moment would never be caused without metaphor. One signifier in view of another, and beneath each signifier, of course, are suspended the many contextures to which the signifier belongs. In metaphor, as opposed to metonymy, the full extension of the vertically arranged associative network of signifiers is suddenly deputized to act as this sort of solution to continuity, meaning a discontinuity, which allows for the signifier to, in some sense, not actually pass over the bar to the signified, but to simulate a sort of passage over the bar, which brings this metonymic proliferation to a halt. The famous line that we got from Victor Hugo some lectures back was, his sheaf was neither miserly nor spiteful. That's Boaz or Boaz, however you spell it. There's a discrepancy there. How do we know that his sheaf was neither miserly nor spiteful? Well, his sheaf in this case is metonymic of himself. Boaz and the traits attached to this sheaf, of course, stand for him. Not much to figure out there. The object of his sheaf, though, does not directly precipitate the metaphor. There's a metonymic connection between the image and the character of Boaz, the image of the sheaf, and it does serve as like the sufficient condition for the sentence to work as a metaphor, to transubstantiate Boaz into his sheaf, vice versa, but for the subject to be abolished, just as the primal father is murdered, just as the name of the father is in reference to the primal father. For the subject to be abolished, it needs to find material support in the entire sentence taken as self-contained. That's where the metaphor resides. The metaphor qua sentence becomes the medium of the character's identity or process of identification, which both vivifies Boaz as a character and also abolishes him. Only within the larger context of the trans individual locus, that is the text of this Victor Hugo poem, can such an impossible conversion take place. Obviously, if you aren't familiar with the poem, which I'm not, so I don't really understand why he's miserly or spiteful or whatever, it's not going to make very much sense. The other here is the text of the poem. So if the dyads which unspool the signifier to signifier thread only allow for imaginary intersubjectivity, that is, oppositional couplings of plus and minus, and the eruption of metaphor, which solidifies identification between two disparate entities, is caused only by virtue of a symbolic virtual point, which escapes the imaginary codependency of these signifying mirroring dyads. But not only does it do that, it organizes these dyads in such a way that a reference point apparently existing beyond language and thus not subservient to the automatism of metonymic desire can take on the responsibility of meaning in the ultimate sense, the meaning of meaning, and therefore achieve the illusion of the signifier passing the bar to unite itself with signified. So let's talk about the quilting function of Athalé's fear of God, which has two interrelated effects. One, the universal fear of God surpasses all species of particular fears, which only retroactively come to fall under the heading of this fear of God. And what it does is give a pre-conscious point of reference, which structures the neurotic's reality. In this case, Athalie, his reality is structured by this universal fear, which is void of content, but puts all other fears into perspective. But something else happens here. Athalie's zeal, which was once diffuse and based in earthly fears, is now somehow transformed by this fear of God into faith. So we have a miraculous transubstantiation here. With this quilting point now firmly installed, particular fears come to pale in comparison to the fear of what God holds in store for the sinner, and the zeal which once characterized Athalie's religious substance becomes ennobled as faith. Slavoj Žižek finds an analog to the transformative power of the quilting point, which he describes as a purely formal inversion. These signifiers, which are thought to lie beyond the immanence of metonymic concatenation, which, as we know, is enslaved to an essential ambiguity so long as the intervention of metaphor does not occur. These signifiers have a metaphoric function in that they infuse meaningfulness, or what Lacan calls signifiance, or what Fink translates signifiance as, which is signifierness. They infuse meaningfulness into an isolated metonymic chain retroactively. The Jew is a famous quilting point for the Nazi insofar as this figure not only provides an explanation for all of society's afflictions, if we were to take society here as almost like a metonymic chain, but is a necessary device for the transformation of the demoralized German, demoralized, of course, after the loss in the First World War, a transformation of a demoralized German into an Aryan Übermensch, miraculously, right? So important. The importance of this is that it's not just that the quilting point or quilting points are privileged signifiers, which endow a specific chain of signifiers with their meaning retroactively, but that they are also capable of inverting a meaning after the fashion of, let's say, the plane mirror in the optical schema. So zeal is inverted into well, faith. I wrote fear here, but is via fear inverted into faith. And the defeated German is inverted into, a member of the master race via this paradoxical quilting point. The optical schema, which we've discussed in previous episodes, depicts how the initial inversion, which is described in the mirror stage essay, but it's still, an underdeveloped part of Lacan's thought at the time of the writing of that essay. This optical schema explains the origin of the I for the infant. And then the optical schema comes in to elaborate on this sort of one-to-one correspondence of mirror image and child, and serves as an elaboration of this mirror stage. But just like to kind of recap what the mirror stage entails here, the physically uncoordinated child has a desire to master the image of what they perceive as wholeness, certain fluidity of motion with which they're confronted in the mirror. And not being able to do so, of course, causes them great frustration because there's this image of unattainable perfection. The child wishes to master this image of unattainable perfection, which he also experiences as usurping his position, what's owed to him, which is a kind of like stability and fluidity. There's appears to him in this mode of fullness or totality outside of his grasp. And so does his vanquishing of this imago also become, in a sense, reductive of his being, as his sense of self is held in suspension between his anticipation of being able to one day totalize himself in this image through its defeat, and of the inevitability of the fact that this moment of certain defeat eludes him. In other words, defeating the image and mastering its wholeness would cause the dissipation of the very imago from which his anticipated certainty derives. We find a further echo of this anticipated certainty in the notion of the ego ideal, which takes over for the ideal ego, or the struggle with the imago, as I just described, as soon as the infant passes through the Oedipus complex. Now, this ideal ego, already an inversion in the sense that the mirror image in the mirror stage becomes more real for the child than his actual body, which has yet to be mapped out, let's say, in the imaginary sense. This ideal ego, which is already an inversion, becomes inverted once more into an ego ideal, which has a now symbolic anticipation of certainty. The image in the plane mirror, a reflection of the real image of the inversion of vase and bouquet in the concave mirror, does not change the shape or color of the illusion of the flowers in the vase, but rather changes the positioning of the bouquet, or the apparent positioning of the bouquet, bringing it into the foreground of the perspective of a viewer, the perspective of the eye, which experiences the bouquet now as placed in front of his view, is an illusion which redoubles the illusion already made possible by the concave mirrors. So, in other words, and I could share the image afterwards of the optical schema, when he's looking in the concave mirror, he sees the vase and the bouquet, but now it's like he experiences it. Correct me if I'm wrong, because I might be messing this up, but now it's like he experiences his perspective differently, where it's like the flowers in the vase now are like in front of him. Is that right?
Yeah, so the way it would work contra, so the first one we have, like as you were pointing out, the concave mirror, which is the revolving mirror. So when the eye in the diagram, which would be the infant, is in the proper position, they will see the image of the inverted bouquet, but because it's revolving, it oscillates from a sort of incomplete image to an inverted totality, which would be the sort of way in which narcissism comes about, this sort of spectacle alert, which is the fragmented body, which brings about frustration because of the let's say the fragility of the imaginary. And we could look back at like the example of the stickleback that oscillates between aggressivity and eroticization of the image, or as Lacan would put, being a predator, being prey, and how this sort of thing maps on when what does he use the example of the beer bottle, and he sees his reflection, he wonders if he's prey or the predator. But then because we have, for instance, the next optical schema, which has the plane mirror, which stands in the middle, it's the fact that not only is that image now able to remain consistent, the other image remains absent because of the stand in the plane mirror. So then not only does the eye see the inverted bouquet as a still image, but also themselves as a reference point. So then we move from
Right.
mysticism to to the instantiation of the ego ideal, which would then
But
reflect.
they see themselves as behind the image we're
Yeah,
looking at right now, if I'm not mistaken.
yeah, and I think like also like in the way like they see the inverted bouquet as well behind them.
Yeah, so I'm a little confused at this point and rusty on it, as to where the exact positioning is. But the important thing to note here, and I'm almost finished my little presentation, but the important thing to note is that the bouquet changes positionality. And now, as you said, the image of the viewer of the bouquet is also included in the reflection. That's the important part. And what results is that the perspective of the eye, and you'll remember that in the optical schema, there's a drawing of an eyeball, which is experiencing this illusion. Now, their point of view emanates from a virtual point, which doesn't actually exist anywhere within a measurable reality
Mhm,
outside of this play of mirrors.
mhm.
So the perspective of the eye structured by this play of mirrors positions the viewer at a purely imaginary point, which affords them a sense of a kind of union, not only a union of psyche and soma, which is what the child looking into the concave mirror at the mirror stage is struggling with, but
Mhm.
it affords them a sense of the union of psyche and soma by establishing a virtuality which enables them to stabilize a illusory perspective of seeing themselves being seen. So in
Yeah,
simpler terms, the only way that you can experience your body as in any sense contained is by being able to be both within and outside of your body
yeah,
at the same time.
both the body and the sort of subjectivization of it are virtual points hooked onto each other. As Zizek will say, like in that chapter you're referencing in 49 if they do, the way that the imaginary hooks onto a virtual point of the symbolic, right? And there's this dialectic between the two.
Exactly, like that's what I'm
Yeah.
building towards. So there is a hooking of the imaginary onto the symbolic here, which means that to be in a body and also to be able to experience this body from an outside perspective, of course, is an impossible situation, but it's one that is made possible in a provisional sense by the establishment of this virtual point. Or as I put it here, one experiences their body as their own, but also an object in the world that is in some sense, well, in a world that's apart from the body. Let me rephrase that.
Mhm.
Uh, I'll read the whole sentence again. I think I kind of got it, but maybe not. The perspective of the eye, structured by this play of mirrors, positions the viewer at a purely imaginary point, which affords them a sense of the union of psyche and soma by establishing a virtuality which enables the subject to stabilize an illusory perspective of seeing themselves being seen, or of experiencing their body as their own, but also as an object in a world which exists apart from them. I am in my body, but my body is also in a world which is not me. This is the ego ideal, which reflects the same sort of impossible rivalry we found in the mirror stage. But in reflecting that rivalry, sublating that rivalry, it holds firm a certain separation between inside and outside, which allows for the formation of a bounding line between the two in
Mhm.
neurosis. Quilting points, that is, however many are necessary to constitute a neurotic, I think perform a similar function, but one that Lacan invites us to understand from the perspective of language itself from that standpoint. The ego ideal then performs a sort of illusory transubstantiation of the ideal ego while sublating this master slave rivalry, which was the ideal ego's motor force initially. The quilting point does a similar thing by sublating an imaginary opposition based on a kind of impossible identification by reflecting the opposition back into the metonymic chain itself and bringing to a halt, metaphorically speaking, the endless sliding of the signify, which is always trying to catch up with the signifying progression of metonymy. Thus, the subject of a statement is transformed, or even just, let's say, brought into being to or play to begin with by the punctual moment of the end of a sentence, which dictates a certain positionality in the same way the I in the optical schema is generated almost ex nihilo from an interaction between two different kinds of mirror, which means it's only a purely formal punctual reality brought about by a play of mirrors. So the various constitutive meanings which maddeningly slide nonstop below the bar of the signifier are now situated, but only in view of the I, which misrecognizes itself as the ego, in parentheses, ideal, for which meaning is made, and for whom all signifiance, that is the meaning of meanings or meaningfulness, will one day be brought to bear. That's it.
That was good. That was really good. Um, and I think really not just with quilting point, but everything that you're building up to, especially with bringing in the optical schema, it's important to bring this into perspective of what Freud was trying to do and why the optical schema is this important, not only schema, but let's say analogy, if we will, or heuristic device to understand again what the infant or as subject is going through. And we have to look at what metapsychology is for Freud. And on our side chat, I talked about if there's important text, for understanding what Freudian metapsychology is, we need to look at the Project for Scientific Psychology, Interpretation of Dreams, um, the 3 essays of sexuality, including narcissism, so 4 essays, and then the beyond the pleasure principle. And specifically, I really want to tackle the essays on sexuality because this does maintain relevancy for not only your summary, but also um, how Oedipus complex relates to the quilting point as Lacan evokes it later on in this chapter, like towards the end. And also just because we're getting into closer to seminar 4, and that's going to be a really big topic. What this child is going through in conjunction with this metaphor or this analogy of the optical schema mirror stage is precisely this moment of well, let's say this sort of mythic moment of trying to unite soma with um psyche, if you will. It's due to the conditions that Freud says that sexuality is polymorphously perverse, and we only understand that sort of retroactively. And so the first, let's say, stage that we um can account for the child is an always already inverted bouquet, or without the mirror, it's autoerotism, which means that it's like the child is without world exterior or interior. So a world without interior and exterior, just purely immersed with a bunch of libidinous, excitation. And yet this moment of the optical schema where the eyeball, which would be the infant, sees this inverted totality of the bouquet in the mirror image is not only sort of synonymous with the stage of narcissism and the bodily image that becomes the ideal ego. It's also these moments, because there's several moments, it's not just one thing, moments that are talked about in Freud's 3 essays of sexuality, where we talk about the erogenous zones or the mapping of the body. And quite succinctly, it's when he evokes these moments of infantile masturbation, the way that the sexuality is sort of mapped onto the body. The thumb sucking are these infantile masturbatory moments, the pleasuring of like the anal region, all these different ways in which the polymorphously perverse sexuality is trying to find something in regards to a hallucinatory object, which isn't instantiated as a real object. But once this encounter of narcissism takes place, this mirror stage, this is where we get into the realm of an imaginary reality that is fragile because it's one of a sort of false mastery and one of purely frustration. And Lacan will evoke, or Lacan will talk about this more in regards to the triangulation, a sort of pre-Oedipal triangulation of mommy, child, and the maternal phallus, or the imaginary phallus. So this imaginary phallus is actually the image of the body that's so frustrating, and yet the child is trying to identify with. But then the plane mirror comes in, and this is where we really get not only the sort of the conditions for the name of the father, but this is what allows the narcissistic child to no longer lean on to be an anaclitic onto the mother's care, or the maternal phallus, to one of the, as you were saying, one of sublation, which then we get an ego ideal, but we also get object love, right? So object love is the is instantiated because of the signifier, and the signifier is going to stand in for the lack of a real object, because the real object is the real image, which is frustrating. So as Lacan says in the beginning of Seminar 3, the imaginary is just everywhere because we're full of aggression and eroticization. That's because of this frustration of a lack of a real object. And so to maintain that lack, we have the plane mirror. To maintain that lack, we have the signifier that stands in. To maintain that lack, we have the thing that stands as a barrier from these bumper cars, as he uses as a metaphor, from bumping into each other. So right there, what keeps imaginary frustration from happening is the way that it is replaced by a sort of symbolic debt or a symbolic lack, which is going to be from frustration to castration. And so that right there leads us into what metaphor metonymy has to do for this chapter, and its quilting point, of course, but the quilting point is the function of of course, the signifier, which we're talking about the name of the father, and the name of the father is what is that metaphor that creates the Oedipus complex.
Yeah, and I mean, two things that came to mind for me while listening to you elaborate on all that. One, it's like with any of these metonymic chains, what we get with the appearance of the quilting point, which could simply be the end of a sentence taken in one sense. It's like we have the end of a sentence, which, of course, in the example that Leon gave us, watch out for your team.
Mhm.
At every point at which you would quilt that statement, the entire meaning changes. But what's also interesting here is how the subject can be, in some sense, changed into its opposite, or let's just say that sort of oppositionality, which we find evidence of at the mirror stage, is not overcome exactly. It's not completely dissolved. It is sublated in the sense that the subject itself is only this kind of oppositionality that characterized the ideal ego, and the ego ideal is an inversion of that. So that's where we get with the quilting point this purely formal inverting process
Yeah,
that Zizek describes, or the reflection into itself. That's one thing. But the other thing I wanted to say to attach it to um, your discourse about the imaginary phallus and what makes this image of the body phallic, it's like, well, for the child to be the imaginary phallus that would, in some sense, complete or be an answer to the mother, the desire of the mother, he becomes a metonymic object.
hmm
It's like this thing that the mother is missing, which he tries to become, not only to satisfy the mother, but also because he has no other option but to be the various objects of desire
hmm
that exist within the purview of his world, because they're he isn't yet able to fully avail himself of the signifier, which divides places
hmm
up. So there's an endless sort of absorption into not just the mirror image, but the world of objects themselves, which are not able to be loved as they should be via the signifier. Yet one becomes the metonymic object, as if there is this desire of the mother, which is in some sense traced out through this metonymic process. But it can the object, of course, is none other than lack. So
yeah,
what the quilting
and
point does is retro is to retroactively organize all of that. And one of and maybe this isn't completely material, but also it's like the rivalry itself, these signifying dyads, which themselves become sort of like monads containing this original moment, which is mythic, of the ego ideal and this rivalry with the mirror image. It's like these dyads themselves, the presence absence dialectic only becomes retroactively structured.
hmm Yeah,
You
no,
know, yeah.
yeah, absolutely. And it's just also another clarification for like, the more for the listeners is that we have to keep in mind that this is able to happen because, as Lacan points out early on in these seminars, but even Chiesa in the second chapter of Subjectivity and Otherness, that the child is already in a world of language, but he is not immersed into a symbolic world, right? It's only through this, immersion into, castration where the other qua language because the becomes the other qua symbolic. So, we still have little others, right? But that's not the same as the big other, which is the sort of symbolic virtual point that the subject of the unconscious is latched to, um, and has a relationship to the big other has a relationship to this sort of battery bank of signifiers that relays the signifier back to the subject of the unconscious. But to really get at what I was really trying to point out is that this is really only able to happen because all these sort of metonymic things in the imaginary are from the other qua language, which usually the other is some type of mother function, which doesn't have to be um, an actual, you know, woman. It could be someone who's masculine. They could be of any gender gender fluidity. The fact is, it's the sort of function one who sort of contains the child and builds upon this sort of anaclitic libidinal investment, and then the one that is able to detach from that and bring forth this prohibition, this name of the father that castrates the subject and allows for sexuality to even be possible, because it's not like there is this sort of sexuality prior to Oedipus or prior to the symbolic. It's that symbolic, which is even, you know, what's the term? Not sutured, but inscribed into culture is what creates the sort of sexuality of both what is permissive and what is prohibited. A really good thing, and it goes even to tie into this notion of the I as not only a shifter, but the I as an other. This really nice quote from Leon Rosichner in his text called Freud and the Limits of Bourgeois Individualism. It's that not only is there an exteriority to the ego, it's structured by the culture in which, I am symbolically invested in, but that even my interiority is not something that's intimate to me, but the interiority, which is the ego reflecting onto itself, is rather where the instantiation of culture creates distance between me and the subject. And that's an important thing, that this symbolic order, or just the signifier and the other qua big other, um, for the subject, create this distance between me to where I may think I know myself, but really I don't know myself. It's really the illusion of the ego. And I guess what I'm trying to say is that, um, for this subject, that the ego acts as a sort of imaginary barrier. And also, it's not repression, but it has a repressive force from keeping, or a repressive force and resistance that keeps the unconscious from coming about, and maintains, as what you pointed out, Nick, the imaginary rivalry, the repetition of the master slave dialectic, which is, of course, indicative of the Oedipus complex, but it remains on a sort of misrecognized level and not what is trying to be announced or evoked by the unconscious, which brings about this sort of signifier, which doesn't have to be a word, it could be a statement, and a statement that's constantly trying to quilt itself. And the more that these signifiers come up, the more that the shifter shifts the meaning when it's evoked. And what is being evoked in this event, which quilting is possible, is a sort of accounting, and I'm going to make a far stretch of a primal scene. And I say that because we recall the primal scene of the Hungarian patient, the pregnancy fantasy that comes up. That's just one example of how the evocation of a primal scene, which is the scene which marks the count of the signifier, or the instantiation, which would be where the Oedipus spawns, right? And that is constantly being reworked through, and the statement which creates the cause of the subject, this signifier as statement, not just as a word or as a letter, but like, something that has a statement. But of course, there is missing letters, there's missing signifiers because of repression on that. So that's why the shifter allows itself to move because new meaning is being put on a new signification to create a sort of reworking of a totality, a mythic moment. Um, is able to happen because you're constantly going back as an analyzan, reworking this thing to find out what the hell happened in my life. Why am I constantly, sabotaging myself? Do I always feel guilty? Neurotics always feel guilty because they're enjoying too much or they're not enjoying enough. Or like, why is it that I'm repeating these things? And the more you get into reworking this thing, the more you find new signifiers that pop up to shift the meaning and retroactively come back to account for the subject. Kind of a lot, but pretty much this ties in with not only quilting point, but also why Oedipus and the name of the father and quilting point as function. Yeah, they tie in together pretty much.
Right. And the ego ideal, of course, isn't necessarily where the mind goes
Mhm.
when you think about quilting point. It was Slavoj who helped me to make this connection, or made it
Yeah,
help them, for they know not what they do. But there's some sense there,
yeah,
because everything you're saying, it kind of builds.
yeah. I was gonna bring that up in my tangent, but I forgot about that. Yeah.
No, but like it sort of stems from the status of the shifter. This is a very counterintuitive point, and one that Paris brought me to, which is basically that the personal pronoun has as much to do with the name of the father
Mhm.
as does prohibition, for
Hmm.
example. And of course, the name of the father here is not just another quilting point, it would be the quilting point of all quilting points, according to Paris, wherein there's this almost topology constituted by the set of all sets,
Yeah.
Russell's paradox, but the set that would contain itself can't contain itself, because that is a violation of the rules of set theory.
Hmm.
And because there is a kind of impossible enfolding of something in on itself here, which is the desire of the mother,
Yeah.
which has no reference, can have no reference outside of itself. Hence the child's frustration,
Hmm.
hence the need to pass through the Oedipus complex and become liberated, in a sense, via castration, because actually circumscribing the desire of the mother is effectively impossible. That impossibility itself is what needs to be repressed. These quilting points
Yeah.
situate every element within a metonymic chain, but only in view of the status of the shifter, and how
Yeah.
that shifter, how the I in that sentence changes. So everything that comes after the I is situated in terms of that I, which stands for the speech act itself.
Hmm.
Now, what does that have to do with the desire of the mother? Well, it's like we don't know how many quilting points are necessary to constitute a neurotic,
Hmm.
but, and I don't know if this is directly speaking to anything you said, but like to bring it back to the sort of sexual valence here, it's like there is a prohibition at play
Hmm.
and there is repression.
Yeah.
Quilting points mark places of repression, in a
Yeah.
sense, and it's almost as if the propriety of
Hmm.
that personal pronoun is always established almost like by these quilting points. So what does that mean in a global sense or an ideological sense? It would mean that the entire field of signification must be marked at points of which many of us may not be aware of. I mean, as we become gradually more integrated into our career environments or create a family or any other number of different social situations, hierarchies in which we
Mhm.
need to establish ourselves. It's as if prohibitions, rules, and laws must be, in some sense, like imbibed.
Yeah.
And there's always it's almost as if there's a certain number of quilting points for any sort of like social situation in which we find
Yeah.
ourselves. And
Yeah. And
it could
it's,
be unknown. But
yeah.
you see how all of this is kind of like
Yeah. Yeah.
interconnected.
Yeah, I mean, like I don't want to get too lost in like the ideology critique because I think it kind of like does like obfuscate really like the metapsychological importance of quilting point and the logic of the signifier and edifice. But it's like if you like give a homology, it's like every time capitalism goes into crisis, the quilting point would be the sort of scapegoat for the ideology and the status quo to maintain itself. 9/11 you maybe could say as like the sort of quilting point in whatever crises were happening on the background which led up to that. And then it's like, okay, it's Al Qaeda, all the be out the lookout for like global terrorism. And everybody like was expressing Islamophobia, or like the example of like that Zizek gives in For They Know Not What They Do with Nazi Germany, that all the sort of the decay and degeneracy of Germany's national identity, financial crises, the loss of the war, all these things had an effect. And then finally the cause of it all was the Jew. So the Jew became the sort of quilting point for all these sort of failed crises, in a way that for Attlee, all these fears take on a sort of perspective shift when the fear of God comes in to stand in for all other fears. The Jew stands in for all, other sort of crises and,
Society's afflictions,
yeah,
essentially.
affliction. Yeah. And I think in the same way, when we bring it back into the realm of psychoanalysis, what we're dealing with, it's like these moments of, let's say, uh, punctual shifts that allow quilting to happen within the child's sexual development. And I'm thinking of this essay that I was just flipping through, passing through the Oedipus complex from Freud, in which he states two things that are important about the Oedipus complex. It's that the when the child is trying to rival and achieve the object, which is the mother's love, he runs into the fact that it is impossible for him to get that, for obvious reasons. He tries to be, as you were describing earlier, the metonymic object for the mother's lack in her desire, her mysterious desire. But then also he runs into an impossibility of trying to be both the child and the sort of metonymic object. So he is caught into a deadlock, and this is where like this moment of frustration, aggressivity, and eroticization happen. If it's not too far of a stretch to kind of not collapse, but relate those things together. But these moments of encounters of the deadlock or impossibility are moments where we could say that could account for the possibility for quilting to bring that into perspective. And that's where the signifier comes in. um, and
Yeah.
and the second aspect of the Oedipus complex is that it must be resolved. And it's not like a resolution like, oh, I passed through the Oedipus complex, I'm good to go,
Yeah.
let's start
Gucci.
where the honey's at. Like that's not
Yeah.
how. But there is a sort of resolution, in the sense that Freud says that the Oedipus complex must be discarded in the way that the baby's milk teeth must be discarded so that new teeth may grow. And I think it kind of points to the same problem that I don't know if Lacan necessarily talks about it, but it's something that's talked about and I know you read it, Laplanche's Freud and the Sexual, where it's like the contradiction is that when puberty, the achievement of puberty takes place, puberty runs into a deadlock because it encounters itself with infantile sexuality, and infantile sexuality stands in the sort of place where biological sexuality should stand in.
Yeah.
And so, this is where it's like, even though the Oedipus complex is resolved, these repetitions and rivalries of encounter constantly come back. So this is where, frustration, privation come about, and quilting is made possible when we retroactively rework our sexual history through analysis. The history of the subject is also the sexual history.
Yeah. It finds its place already occupied. That is, pubescent
Yeah.
sexuality finds its place already occupied by polymorphous perversity, infantile sexuality, which is, in a sense, non-biological.
Yeah. And in the analytic sense, it's like, the ego ideal is definitely something that is important for this quilting, because it's like, well, the ego ideal, the way that I think it was defined in like this one paper that I was reading to understand the mappings for the graph of desire. It's like the mapping for the ego ideal is important because like the ego ideal is the bedrock for synthesizing not only like the signifier and the I that come up, but also uh the unary trait, right? The unary trait pops up in the ego ideal, which relates to the I, which relates to, the signifier that is for the name of the father, right? And as that great example that Paris said about how the personal pronoun has everything to do with the name of the father, and so like the way that the personal pronoun shifts the meaning on the level of the ego ideal in analysis allows for like the quilting to come up, because it's the ego ideal that comes about when we are sort of immersed into the symbolic order as a castrated speaking being. And also the shadow of the ego ideal is that of the superego, which misrecognizes the law of the father and, reiterates these injunctions of prohibition and enjoyment.
Well, I'm going to try to keep all of these plates spinning as best as I can right now because there's a lot going on, of course. I think what we're getting at is this: the Oedipus complex, one passes through it, there is something akin to a resolution at the end, but
Mhm.
it's a resolution not without consequences. The self-referentiality of the desire of the mother, which the mother, being already herself castrated, is subject to.
Yeah.
This desire can have no object
Yeah.
because it's desire. Desire has no object. The child who is trying to, in some sense, have and be simultaneously and is on the cusp of having and being is maddened by the desire of the mother insofar as he has no choice but to be the entire spectrum of desired objects for her because
Mm.
again he doesn't have the signifier at his disposal. So this self-annihilation of the signifier, remember the signifier is absence and presence.
Mhm.
The opposite of a signifier day is not day, rather
Mhm.
than night. That's the true opposite. It's almost as if it's like presence and absence are impossibly enmeshed
Mhm.
for the child who volunteers himself as the metonymic object of his mother's desire and is always off the mark there, because
Yeah.
there is no object. It's an impossible situation to
Yeah.
be in. It's one which causes anxiety and from which the child needs to be liberated. Now, what does that? Of course, the name of the father. The name of the father is the paternal metaphor, and it's the name of the father which signifies the desire of the mother. But there's a problem there in that it's like, okay, it effectively bars this desire. But because by definition, the desire of the mother cannot contain itself, let's
Mhm.
say, in the same way a set cannot contain itself as a set,
Mhm.
just by definition, the name of the father doesn't actually draw a circle around the desire of the mother and relegate it to the unconscious. That circle can't really be drawn by the name of the father. And I think what is repressed in this moment, and it's not primal repression that I'm talking about. I'm talking about repression post Oedipus complex. It's like
Yeah.
what is actually
Secondary.
repressed here in secondary repression is this impossible knowledge which would correspond to the desire of the mother, which is named by the father, but is in no sense, and this name is in no sense a name which can tell the child what the desire of the mother really is, or
Mhm.
give it its object. But because we have a name of the father, now we have the possibility of the nexus, or as Paris put it, the point of attraction of all quilting points,
Mhm.
which would be, at least at this stage in Lacan's thinking, the non-deceptive other, that
Mhm.
which encircles us, that which is the meaning of meaning, which of course none of us can actually answer, but all of our symptoms, the symptoms that we bring and demand that the to analysis and demand that the analyst signify for us, has to do with an excess
Mhm.
produced by Oedipus, which is the excess of the signifier itself, which of course is just a kind of refraction of that initial imaginary impossible rivalry that had to do with this enmeshment of presence and absence. The only way we're freed from being completely enslaved to metonymy in this sense is through the metaphoric function of these quilting points, which mark, I think, like places
Mhm.
of repression. So what does that have to do with Schreber? Well, Schreber doesn't have a name of the father, and everyone says he doesn't have a name of the father. Therefore, what would be repressed in neurosis actually is foreclosed and therefore reappears in reality. That's not wrong, but the name of the father isn't a quilting point just like any other quilting point. It's a quilting point of all quilting points, meaning he lacks, as Lacan, I think, puts it, a certain model of virility,
Mhm.
and the realization that he lacks this model of virility only comes about after he's been appointed judge. And what
Yeah.
that means is that this becomes a sexual crisis for him. And it's not because for the neurotic, they have an easier time of answering the question, the hysterical question, what
Yeah.
is a woman? It's because for Schreber, who we could imagine is almost at the stage of being the answer to the desire of the mother at all times,
Mhm.
uh, or at least was able to fend that off through pure imitation of the other. As soon as he's confronted with this impossible deadlock, this dilemma, which has to do with the absence of the model of virility,
Mhm.
now it's as if he has quilting points in a sense, but he doesn't have that center of attraction of all
Yeah.
quilting points. And what that means is that he's only able to stop this metonymic sliding by one, well, becoming a woman.
and thus rejecting the sort of knowledge of any castration,
and thus
versus.
rejecting the knowledge of any castration.
And so this is where therefore foreclosure, this is what that means. This is what how it functions, for Schreber.
Whereas I would think for the neurotic, it's like whether if they're obsessional, their obsessive
Yeah.
activity is what fends off this non-knowledge, which is characteristic of
Yeah.
the unconscious. And it really is it's an impossible, it's the impossibility of
Yeah.
this desire of the mother ever having a true response.
Yeah, and so their question, once they become hystericized, and to really think about it, neurotics have two unconscious choices. They either become, the phobia is one, but they're really the main two. So do I become obsessional and have this sort of imaginary rivalry, or do I become hysteric and sort of be the missing object of castration? And with that, they both are structured like a question, but the question is always never the one that they're trying to ask. They ask a different question to repress the non-knowledge of, you know, uh, what does it mean to be a man or a woman? So rather the question is, to the analyst, how can I be, normal again? How can I enjoy better again? Right? The sort of misrecognized question then ends up becoming the real question that only comes up, in these uh, small punctual moments that of different signifiers coming up with it, each session in the transference, and then as you keep working, then a sort of full uh, metonymic chain becomes, sort of metaphorized with, the encounter of the unconscious, bringing out the name of the father.
And what's interesting to me, I was thinking about this recently. It's sort of like we have a topology here between name of the father and desire of the mother, and that's like, yeah, and it's repeated in these metonymic chains, but it's sort of later when we will talk about you know this there is no sexual relation. It's like if the name of the father is meant to directly signify the desire of the mother, then it's sort of like here we have a desire which I said you can't really draw a circle around, but
Yeah.
it becomes barred. And it's barred both in a retroactive sense in the way that it's at odds with itself because desire is at odds with itself, and that is how it is propagated. But also it's like the attempt to count the other as one fails, and it's through that very failure in a sense that the exceptional one of the dead primal father is able to come about. So it's a one counted against the background of the failure to be able to count the desire of the mother
Mhm.
as one. And this is the essence of not one, not two, in a way.
Mhm.
It's
Yeah.
not one or the other. It's that this one only comes about through the impossibility of counting the
Yeah.
other as one. This is, I think, and I could be totally off base here, but exactly the kind of non-knowledge that Schreber is a martyr to, as
Yeah.
opposed to the repressed neurotic who escapes it through other means in obsessionality. And I know you could contrast that with hysteria better than I.
Yeah. Well, the thing is that both the neurotic and the psychotic are martyrs of the unconscious of this sort of non-knowledge, but the difference is that the was it Lacan says is that the neurotic gives a sort of testament for it in a way that sort of needs to be deciphered. And again, it's like they ask the question but aren't asking the question. Why are you telling me you're going to Krakow when I know you're going to Krakow? To give an example, obviously that's not a question. Well, yeah, it is a question, but like it has a different
You know,
context. But versus like the psychotic, which cannot give a coherent discourse because they lack the sort of other that could sort of relay the message back in the inverted form, right? is that they don't have uh the temporality doesn't come up to allow them to enunciate it.
Yeah,
That's
because like with that joke, the subtext there is, I know you're lying to me, but somewhere like there is a background of non-deception.
Mhm,
It's just that it through the inversion of lying as truth, and then the further inversion of telling the truth to deceive,
mhm,
what it brings out, of course, is the putting into question of
mhm,
that non-deceptive
mhm,
other, which the neurotic must assume is always there
mhm,
to guarantee the truth of what's being said, or guarantee the place where
right.
a truth can be registered. Even if at this moment I might fall prey to deception,
Yeah.
truth is somewhere registered beyond me. That is the necessary trans individual
Uh-huh.
locus that helps me, that and ensures that I can misrecognize myself as an ego
Hmm.
in the world, at
Yeah.
least for Lacan now.
Yeah, no, that was pretty, yeah, I agree with that 100%.
It's just that for Schreber, I think deception is something else entirely. It's like he sees a certain register of language as being empty and
Hmm.
meaningless, and then another register of language as having this surfeit of meaning that I guess would represent for him signifierness.
Well, and it's also interesting because it goes back to like the question of certainty and deception goes back to the whole thing about Descartes and how like, the deceptive God or like the God that doesn't lie. But for Descartes, it's like there could be evil demon that deceives me, right? In my quest for certainty. And yet for Schreber, it's like the deity is the only thing that he's certain of, and these little souls and little men that are sort of be extensions of God somehow also tell him things, but also deceive him. But yet, like within that, there is like the sort of certainty that, cannot deceive him, the certainty that he is God's lover and he's supposed to restore the order to the world, right? And I think that is like the sort of interesting thing. But the limits to Schreber's delusion, it is encountering a deadlock. And it's about, Schreber's transcendental freedom from encountering God, but also the omnipotence and omniscience of God, because can God predict the
The
lottery?
results of the lottery, yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
when God doesn't know the contingent things of the mortal world, he can only know certain little metonymic facts about it. When these souls go up to blessedness and the sort of note-taking system that he has of each soul, he gets a new fact. Like the sort of secretary writing down a new note-taking, or he calls it the note-taking system, but a new fact about the contingent world of mortals. But he can never have a grand totality of what this world is, its future, its destination, and or destiny, right? And so it puts into question, necessity and contingency, and can God know, the future of something that runs on probability and possibility?
Yeah, like
Yeah.
there is a contingency, and perhaps it's the contingency of the letter itself, which is somehow outside of God's grasp, even for someone as pious as Schreber.
Yeah.
Who could be more
Right.
pious than Schreber? Schreber,
Yeah,
God
he's a
chose
pious.
it.
Yeah, it is not only that he's pious to God, but he's also a pious, enlightened person because he comes to God through enlightenment, following enlightenment, rigorous reason. His entire thing, it's like he's not psychotic in the sense that like, oh, he doesn't know, he's just crazy and he's speaking irrational things. It's like, no, he's psychotic because he's so certain and super rational. He came to God through induction and deduction so well that that's like part of his psychotic, delusion. And he's like, what does he say? He's like, the psychiatrists think I'm psychotic because they think I'm referring everything to myself, and that's apparently what psychotics do. No, it's not me who refers to myself.
It's
It's
him,
me who refers to me about everything and won't stop. That's it.
right? And it's like his suffering is due to the fact that the trans individual locus, as I keep calling it, this other,
Hmm.
capital O, can only manifest itself as the third personal pronoun
Hmm.
beyond I and you as a him, so
Yeah.
long as it implicates Schreber himself as an I.
It's not me, it's you.
It's not me, it's you.
Sorry,
And
it's
it's
him,
like,
it's him, it's him. Yeah, it's him. It's not me, it's him. Yeah.
so his entire world is kind of allowed to cohere only thanks to a him that ultimately regards Schreber, whose
Yeah.
every thought and feeling is expressed in reference to Schreber, because this is a rupture or like a miscarriage of the, let's say, the separation of the interior from the exterior, in the sense that that kind of bounding line that I mentioned in my presentation is not fully there,
Hmm.
in the sense that that joke about Krakow wouldn't make any sense to Schreber, because for him it's like the, this kind of like, this anticipation of certainty. It's almost like it's already arrived. The certainty has
Hmm.
already arrived for him, but there is an anticipation in language. But language has to be separated into two registers for him.
Hmm.
Whereas in neurotic language, it's like, what's the next thing that's going to be told to me? What about the thing after that? Am I being lied to? Will this next word clarify what's
Hmm.
been told to me? What about the next? There will be a quilting point wherein the chain of signifiers being given to me right now will make sense, and I'll be able to situate myself vis-a-vis that punctuation, that moment of punctuation. For Schreber, there are only those two registers.
Hmm.
They're not, those two registers don't intertwine
Yeah.
in
Well,
such a way. Yeah.
that's also interesting because like again, like he says well, Lacan says like in this chapter how like in psychosis the signifier and signified appear in a divided form, in this structure. And my question was because he mentions about quilting, but he also talks about like nodding. Like, so for the neurotic, it's like, of course, Lacan, privileges the signifier over this dyadic signifier-signified relationship, but yet signifier as a purely writing down thing and the signified as signification only meet up in unison in a nodding for the neurotic, which is a quilting point. The quilting point creates, a punctual moment, which has signification, which retroactively goes back, to the start of the sentence, the I and the statement or the full statement, the ending of it, and retroactive to the subject, right? And so in that point, it's like that's where we see quilting point become a function where we see the way that this point holds together meaning and signifying pure writing and its significance. Whereas like for the psychotic, this is impossible. It's divided, and all we have are just these pure metonymic moments with no the quilting point for all quilting points, for lack of a
Right.
better.
Where it's sort of like Schreber is basically making himself the candidate for the quilting point of
Yeah,
all
especially
quilting
having
points.
to finish these cut off sentences, or like these like the sentences that don't finish. He has to like fill in the blanks, and like the sort of noise that happens when he hears these souls or these birds speak. What is it? It's like the wind, something like so like
Yeah.
like whenever there's like a message relayed to him by the other, it's like always distorted, cut off, or like muffled by these sort of verbal hallucinations of like sound, wind, and all these other things.
So he responds with his body in a sense, which is what
Yeah.
Lacan said. It's like
Yeah.
he responds with his body, and it's like the first model of the signifier really is the mirror image of the body
Yeah.
for the infant, but it's almost as if he's stuck at the stage of seeing the bouquet in the concave mirror
Yeah.
as an ideal ego.
And he's always mapping his body out in these weird ways, like not having a stomach, but then when the nurse comes in with food, then she's bringing him his stomach as well. And then like then he could like what is it like he can only take a shit when like it's presented to him. So like right there he's like mapping in all these sort of libidinalness ways in a secondary narcissistic way, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. He can, yes, because he does not have object love. He can only libidinally offer himself
Yeah,
as the, I would think, yeah, the ponte capiton, the
yeah,
quilting point for all moments in a physical sense. And it kind of goes back to, I think, what I was trying to get at in that presentation, where it's sort of like to be in my body, but for my body to be in a world which I recognize is not me.
yeah,
That's the achievement of Oedipus in a sense, but if obviously just by reading one page of Schreber's memoir, you can see that that's not the case for him.
yeah, yeah, and it's like the body that he's mapping on is pure delusion. But it's not to say that the neurotic is without delusion. We all have delusion. Fantasy is a delusion, but in the way that it operates for us is completely different from the way that it operates for Schreber. And like Lacan points out, we live in a shared delusion. Discourse of freedom is a shared delusion. But
Yes.
in the way that we repress resigned abandonment, Schreber can't. We repress the sort of non-knowledge that brings about this sort of deadlock, this impossibility.
This is really interesting. And this is where I think ideology critique does come into the argument because, yes, fantasy is ideologically structured, but I think what people miss when they start with at the when they have the sort of Zizekian or um, McGowanite conceptualization of the quilting point as their place of departure, then they might miss how it is presented in this seminar in which we encounter the quilting point at the far end of this discussion of metaphor and metonymy, but also the quilting point as a question. And the question is how many quilting points constitute a neurotic? And at what stage does a certain lack of a quantity of quilting points result in psychosis? So it's like with the delusion of freedom, there is no answer to that question because we see the double bind of freedom itself
Mhm.
is the very problem where that goes misrecognized, not whether do we have too little or too much of it, which is always how the debate is structured.
Yeah.
um but it's like for Schreber, there's almost a certain level of like intellectual honesty there where yes, he has delusions, but because they aren't the shared delusions of an ideologically conditioned fantasy, the fabric of his reality, well, it falls apart.
Yeah.
And that name of the father, that model of virility, whatever it is in any given social context within any specific epoch, it might have a completely different shape. It might be contoured differently. The reason that virility matters is not because it's like people need to understand what it means to be a man, but because of what I was saying before. It's like that mathematical
Hmm.
problem itself. There are different ways of repressing that knowledge, I think. And it's sort of like these quilting points, or society itself is a strategy of repression, in the same way that Lacan says in television. It's like, does, in response to Malaire's question about whether the family is the ultimate agent of repression, Lacan turns that question on him and says, why wouldn't family itself be a form of repression? So I
Hmm.
think this is where ideology
Yeah.
comes into it.
Yeah. No. Bravo. Yeah. Should we quote it right there?
Yeah, yeah, we could.
Yeah. Yeah. It's been like an hour and a half already.
I hope people aren't disappointed by the fact that we haven't addressed the question of whether object A is quilted to the master signifier here or there. But it's like, I think it you can fail to notice where quilting point appears, and when you, like, for the first time in Lacan's work, and it's like when you've spent as much time with three as we have in the past, it's almost going on like more than a year. It makes sense that it appears now.
Yeah, well, and it's interesting because object A is a sort of metonymic object for Lacan in Seminar 6, and it does have a sort of imaginary effect. But then later on, when we get into 9 and 10, it's like the sort of both desirable, the cause of desire, and it's also the sort of anxiety object. It's the sort of, the statement where he's like, anxiety is not without an object. It's that sort of uh thing, but then in Seminar 11 it has everything to do with the way that we enter in that Unbegriff, right? That sort of count that causes the subject, the way castration marks the subject. It's like it doesn't create the subject, the sort of even divided line. It's sort of like this like way that the subject is divided and there's always a remainder. The way that the subject accounts for itself, it's always dividing itself, right? It's trying to, you could say, like we have, like, counting, and division is like a sort of grouping of accounting, and there's always this leftover, right? Especially when you do long division with, certain numbers, they don't fully divide evenly, like, and so you always have this remainder. So you keep dividing, you get this less than nothing, this excess. So the objet a is just, what returns, that excess that returns, which of course gets elaborated in Seminar 16, the with jouissance, surplus, and knowledge production. But the point is like, I think for like that question, if that's a question people want to ask, what's the relationship between objet a and the master signifier? No, like objet a has to do with this sort of, leftover encounter of like the subject's like enjoyment. It is the part of that subject that is missing, right? Which is
Right.
due to the castrative function, which is consubstantial to the name of the father, right? We don't get
Right.
ja without the division that comes from castration.
Yeah. It's a question that people wonder. Yeah, like
Yeah.
quilting, the master signifier. But I think it's just good to have a
Hmm.
discussion of
It's
quilting
like
point
they
before.
I think, yeah, the thing is that these concepts relate, but they're not one and the same. you know,
Yeah, yeah.
there
People
is
have
a
debates
there
about it,
is
but
like a sort of distinction between quilting point and mass and or name of the father, master signifier, but it's like they aren't collapsed into one imminent thing, right? When it becomes like vitalistic in a sense, and we lose, the sight of like what the logic of the signifier structure is.
and like I guess we should also maybe before we finish it up just kind of like disambiguate um I, I guess there are three quilting points in a sense. It's like the quilting point of the subject in a metapsychological way, the quilting point of the session, and then there's like ideology critiques quilting point. We don't have to go
Yeah.
through all of them, but like what we've been discussing more so is the meta psychological definition of quilting point.
Yeah, and quilting point in regards to variable length session does have to do with the meta psychology because
It does for sure,
it does have to do with the sort of announcement
but
of
there's a quilting point of the session itself, and then
yeah,
um the idea that there however many quilting points for the subject and the two
yeah,
meanings like allied, but one's
yeah. And I think the thing
clinical.
with that is that it's like it's really like up to the analyst to spot, the shifting of meaning. And so like it's become a sort of like ad nauseum stereotype that Lacan was known for his variable length sessions. So like they would be like 3 to 5 minutes. Well, yes, that's true, but there's another aspect to that in his essay where he says it's like they could go from anywhere from like I forget what number he says, like I think it's like 3 to 5 minutes, and then or they could exceed the standard time, which is about 50 minutes. So you can have a session that goes for like an hour to an hour and a half, and that's actually more dreadful than the anticipation of the um, the session stopping at like a 5 minute mark. In fact, like, there's some libidinal enjoyment of like, oh, I wonder what I'm gonna say when like the analyst stops. Is it gonna be 3 minutes or 5 minutes or 10 minutes? And in fact, the more it goes on, the more, you know, gruesome it is. And like it's like you talk so much that you just want to stop talking, but like you can't because the analyst hasn't stopped the session. So it's like when that moment to conclude or not conclude, but the moment to sort of punctuate the session for the time of that day, is how quilting point is applied. It's like where are we going to leave the mark off? And sometimes it's not even like something that is said; it's something that isn't said. We'll just stop at this moment and like at an incomplete sentence or like an incomplete like point of the narrative.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Yeah,
And I had this many times, and not like a sort of quilting point where like shit has happened like within 5 minutes. No, usually like I think the earliest my analyst has stopped is like at like the 40-minute mark, you know. Usually he'll go on for 50 minutes to an hour, and I think the longest we went on was like an hour and 15. Um,
mm.
but yeah, and I think the problem though with quilting point and ideology critique, while I do like the way that Zizek brings it out in For They Know Not What They Do, I think that it has to be addressed that you can't really talk about quilting point without the logic of the signifier. And so, like when you have to be able to account for this logic of the signifier, and then it puts into question, well, do we end up uh falling into Lacanian ideology, as Gabriel Tupanaba says, and trying to apply these clinical categories, these clinical tools as a means to encompass all reality. And so, like, we don't need to
Yeah.
do any social science. Like,
Yeah.
psychoanalysis becomes the science of all sciences. And so then we run into a problem where it's like, okay, now we just made psychoanalysis an S2. So this is like the sort of double bind that one has to be wary of if they're trying to add psychoanalysis to ideology critique, which is a Marxist thing. Um, that's like my sort of like not a critique but forewarning. But the reality is that there's like because of the like popular current of uh, Slovene school and their effect on the Anglo world, that, there's this sort of like insistence to want to do something creative with these concepts and forget, their contextual application, and they end up falling into the very thing that, Malarians
Yeah.
do. And Tupanaba has critique. So that's the only thing I would say. I'm just gonna say the whole thing over again, but
Yeah, and I just
yeah,
think the quilting point as a concept that might be one of the worst offenders in that respect.
yeah, yeah.
So hopefully we've cleared some things up. I learned a lot today.
Yeah, that one, and then the generalized foreclosure, I think.
Oh yeah, yeah. Well, big debate right there. Like that's Trump Kamala level debate. Uh looking forward to watching that. But yeah, hopefully for our follow-up discussion on this, we will have Max and a special guest whose name shall go unsaid to talk
Yeah.
about this. So let's keep our fingers crossed that we can get us all in the same Zoom room soon enough, and we will be wrapping up Seminar 3 soon, very soon.
Yes, I'm excited.
That enjoy your simping, everybody.
Yeah.
All right, signing off.